Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Chuck Tatham. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Densify, and I'm pleased to be hosting our webcast today with the FinOps Foundation, specifically J.R. Storment, the Executive Director from the Foundation. And we're talking today all about what we've titled Solving the Number One Challenge in FinOps. And we're going to base this discussion on some excellent research that the foundation has done recently, a new survey that they conducted. We're going to dig into that in a moment. I will mention that along with us today is also Andy Walton, a VP at Densify in our pre-sales organization, and he is going to moderate, watch the questions, potentially interrupt us, but probably save Q&A till the end, if that's okay. The ability to ask a question, log a question is there the entire time, so please don't be shy, don't wait till the end, log your questions as we go. And we'll do our best to leave some time at the end. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. We will talk about a little bit about introduction to the topic of the day, sort of set up what we're hearing from our customers and sort of hint toward the types of things that JR is going to talk about. He will then talk about the foundation and the state of FinOps survey that I mentioned, and the interesting top challenges that came out of that survey. I will then zero in on what we have identified in that survey as the top challenge. It's actually very distinctly showing in the data. I'm going to base that on what we hear and see in some of our top performing customers. What do we see good looking like in that regard, specifically around process and culture, and of course a little bit about technology, but we'll try to keep the product marketing to a minimum. And then we'll have Q&A. We'll also give you some resources at the end. So just to kick off, first of all, JR, would you like to say hello and welcome to you?
Yeah, hello. I won't say much because I've got slides coming up, but yeah, definitely you mentioned Andy jumping in with questions. Happy to be interrupted if anybody has clarifying things or bits in here, because I'm going to be sharing some data, and there's a lot more behind it. So definitely can field more advanced questions on it as we get there.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for putting on the fancy collared shirt today. It's very formal.
You're the best.
So this is, sometimes seems a little bit like we're stating the obvious, but it always amazes me actually when people have an aha moment around this, and that is that with cloud, we've really changed the way cost management is or requires to be conducted. Not too long ago, we were in a world where central procurement, physical gear was purchased, provisioning was tightly controlled because it was physical. Today, we are in a very different world. The agility of cloud, the diversity of use cases that are being driven into the cloud mean that in most organizations, there are potentially many individuals, in some large organizations, hundreds of individuals that are able to provision and make what they sometimes view as micro purchases pretty much constantly. Containers introduce an additional challenge. We'll talk about that, the resource specification, but the fact that this is happening all the time is confounding a lot of ability to control the cost. And there's this expectation that organizations should be able to control it on the fly, get the agility, but control it on the fly. And that makes for very challenging environment. And so contributing to this optimization challenge are a number of other dynamics. The DevOps trend means that consumption and provisioning is happening in much more rapid cycles, faster than ever before. the individuals that are making those distributed decisions are often basing those decisions on educated guesses. And the interesting dynamic here is that they're really not paid to worry about cost. They're paid to worry about speed and performance and agility, and they're doing their jobs by responding to the business. Infrastructure as code, things like Terraform, CloudFormation, are hard coding those desires into the infrastructure or into the code. We sometimes call it purchasing as code, which should give CFOs a bit of a chill, but it's happening at a greater and greater degree as cloud scales. These technologies are being used to provision and scale, and that's where that hard coding is happening. And then the last thing, and Jared will talk towards this, is that there's a sense of resistance in a lot of cases, or at least an acceptance of the status quo once things are deployed, because it's safe and easiest to leave things the way they are. There's very little risk if things are running well, and so let's just leave it. And so it really demands an organization-wide or integrated and collaborative approach to solving this challenge, which is really the birthplace of JR's foundation. And I'm going to hand it over to him to talk about it and the survey. So I will make you presenter.
Yeah, thank you. I love your talk track around all that. I feel like I've given a similar one in the past. I mean, this idea that engineers in many cases, now sort of hold the keys to not just deploying infrastructure, but also the spending associated with that. I always like to think of it as a, can you see the screen, the green screen?
We're good.
Yep, great. It's sort of like, you give them an unlimited credit card that they can spend as much as they want on, but they don't ever actually see the bill. And that's really, when we've talked about this recently in the foundation, there's been pushback. Well, it's not engineers' fault, and we're not meaning to knock on engineers. What has changed, right, in this distributed model is a complete behavior shift of, okay, now you have a new part of your job that you have to do, and where historically you didn't have to think about cost and you couldn't impact it. And so there's that big aspect of not just educating, but also shifting the job role, and then getting a world where we can get those engineering teams thinking about cost and also working with finance teams who now need to understand cloud a lot better than they do, because they can't report in that traditional way. So by way of introduction, the FinOps Foundation is really here to advance the people who do cloud financial management or FinOps or cloud cost optimization or whatever you want to call it. We are focused on being a vendor neutral organization that develops community for these people, that educates them, and develops open source best practices. We like to say we're practitioner led. We've got about 3,000 practitioners who are actually out in enterprises or tech startups or large companies doing this work. As part of that, we also have, vendors who are plugged in like Densify. We have clouds who are plugged in who are, Google and whatnot, vetting the information for us. So really trying to create a central standardized place for all this to come together. I'm the executive director of the FinOps Foundation, which is a part of the Linux Foundation. This is the first time as a nonprofit employee for me. It's been an interesting ride. Early 2019, published a book called Cloud FinOps that was really a collection of a lot of the early work the FinOps Foundation teams did to start to lay out this roadmap. And background, I was spent the previous 9.5 years as co-founder of Cloudability and wore a bunch of different hats over that time, everything from product to customer success to GM of EMEA, and left that company about a little over a year ago to focus on the foundation. So I have no ties or outstanding anything to any of my former employers, totally in the nonprofit world now. So when we talk about FinOps, there's a long description, but I want to unpack what's in here a little bit. It's really about bringing that financial accountability to the variable spend model of cloud, right? In data center world, it's easy to know what you're spending, much harder in cloud. And specifically to the first line there, the prescriptive model, FinOps is really about giving a roadmap of actions for visibility, for allocation, for optimization, to help organizations build out the practice to do this. A lot of it is a cultural shift. And to the second bullet point, one of the hardest things is the collaboration between these disparate teams that historically haven't had to work closely together, right? Finance could report a quarter later, spending was static and predictable, long procurement cycles, That's not the case in cloud, as Chuck was laying out, right? Things are moving quickly. And the idea with this, to the last point, is not necessarily about saving money or spending less on cloud. A lot of the enterprises that are in the FinOps Foundation are in the midst of massive migrations, right? Spoke with one recently, and they had identified 24 million a year that they could save in their cloud provider, and they weren't doing anything with it. I was like, why not? What's the problem? And they said, well, I have a $2 billion IT budget. Spending time to save 24 million doesn't do much for me. Like, once we have $1 billion in cloud, then we'll start talking about it. So the idea with all this is, how do we accelerate decision making? How do we accelerate comfort and trust in cloud, right? How do we show that there's the right value coming from every dollar you're spending? So maybe if you're cloud native, you hit your peak cloud, you might want to optimize and save. If you're a large enterprise, you're probably just trying to move more quickly and make the right decisions as you go. So one of the things we launched last week, first time, is a State of FinOps report. This is something we've been wanting to do for a while. It came out of this idea that we both wanted to better understand the demographics of the people in the membership, but also there was a lot of questions around, what should I be doing? What are the right KPIs, the right benchmarks and challenges? So the survey that we launched in, I think it was late November, early December, the first pass of the data came out last week. We had about 804 responses from our 3,000 practitioners, which we were very excited about for a month-and-a-half long campaign, especially given it's a 15-minute survey to complete. And these people reported that between them, they managed about $30 billion of cloud spend. So some very, very large spenders in there across the board. Little demographic information, over 70% of those who completed it were from large organizations, 1,000 plus, 10,000 plus organizations, and a big mix of different profiles of cloud spend, some public cloud first, some all in cloud, some migrating, et cetera. We're not going to get into different slices of that data today, but in the coming months, we're going to be unpacking a lot more of this data by that type of profile. Really critical thing with all of these FinOps practices is it's constantly maturing, right? You're never done with it. It's not linear. We have a FinOps life cycle that's a circle, right? You inform, you optimize, you operate. Because not only is the organization going to be at different stages, crawl, walk, run, as we call it, each individual team in an organization may also be at different stages, and those teams are constantly turning over. So when we looked at this data, we really tried to, we have people first self-report where they thought they were, and look to see how differing answers came out of the back of that. And this was the biggest, most important question for us, which are, what are your top challenges? What's the hardest thing for you in FinOps? Probably no surprises. The title of this webinar hinted at it. Getting engineers to take action was the #1 item. As I mentioned, there's been pushback and conversation about this since we announced this. Well, is it really about getting engineers to take action? That puts it all on them. Well, we'll unpack. It's actually probably more about enabling engineers, right, to take these actions to make fast moves. And then there's a whole other areas, challenges we're not going to cover today, but we do have in the larger report that deal with all the areas you expect, forecasting being hard in cloud, shared costs. One of the most important ones that we're going to weave through all this is the orange one on the top right, which is aligning finance teams to tech teams, right? That's a consistent theme in the cultural aspect of this. So wanted to pull out a couple of interesting data points that we thought from the questions that people answered. One of them, which I know Chuck is going to cover a bit, what he sees in his space, but how are you currently having your infrastructure, particularly compute, broken down between reserve instances, on-demand, spot, et cetera? Not surprisingly, pretty big gap between the crawl people who had 40% of RI or savings plan coverage up to the runners who had 62%. Smaller gap, interestingly, on the spot side. This is such an interesting process to watch, as people think RIs or savings plans should be easy, but the real challenge with this stuff, I think, isn't even often calculating what to get. It's getting the organization up to speed, ready, the finance teams comfortable, engineering teams willing to commit to what they're doing. So on the flip side of this, we also asked, where do you think you should be? Like, what are your targets or your goals? So if you remember, the walkers said they were at 40%. They thought they should be at 60. Sorry, the crawlers. The walkers were at 53%. They thought it should be at 75. Runners were about 60%. They thought it should be at 80. Now, these numbers actually varied if we looked at, these are the medians across everything. If we looked at runners in companies who were enterprises who were heavily migrating to cloud, some of them were saying 92, 95% because they knew they were going to be moving more and more to cloud over time and they weren't worried about going over it. Interestingly, the born in cloud and the cloud native folks, had lower run stage RI recommendation numbers because they were trying to optimize, essentially use less, and also using a lot of other cloud native services, looking at going to serverless, more containers, et cetera. So the big thing that we asked, and happily it worked out, we asked what their top challenges were. Then we also had an open-ended question at the end that said, how do you get engineers to take action? Now, happily that turned out to be the top selected challenge, but we got over 500 write-in answers for this that we're currently mining through to basically pull out themes. So I'm gonna show you 3 sets of these answers. Apologies, there's a lot of text on the page because they're direct quotes, but want to give you a sense of how people are tackling this challenge. For the crawl stage people, it invariably started with visibility, right? And I highlighted the first answer there that I pulled. I loved, there were a number of these, like, how do you get engineers to take action? Well, we don't know how to do it. We're still struggling with it. Typically, people start to think of this RACI model. Okay, let's say engineers are responsible in this way and product teams are responsible here, but then they start to make the cost visible, right? They start to do dashboarding, they start to bake in reporting into other areas. KPIs are often something that start to come in around, okay, we need to look at cost right alongside our other performance metrics. And typically it is a cadence-based review, right? We're coming in, we're working with the teams on a monthly or quarterly basis to look at this stuff. I did love a few of the comments in here around getting finance and engineering in the same room. When we were working on the FinOps book and interviewing a bunch of people who had done this work for years, one of the big challenges was understanding the motivations of the other teams, right? How do you get engineers to think like finance people and feel their pain and vice versa? And that, I think, was an interesting theme here in the beginning, which is how do you start to get that dialogue between those teams? This large text at the bottom is actually a direct quote from Chuck when we were looking at this yesterday, which I thought was great. Is that, there's all these tactics, so they're really just a symptom of the problem, right? So the next thing that people start to tackle is how do we start to gamify? And this was more the walk stage approach. How do we start to get different incentives in place to get things going? There's game theory approach. We're actually doing a large member call on March 2nd where one of our members, Comcast, is going to show this gamification they've done of this. They're going to capture the flag model. But a lot of those ideas get into cost optimization contests, hackathons. That's all great, but these tend to be point in time, right? They're one-offs. You get a bunch of, I don't know, what's the financial term for this? Financial technical debt built up, a lot of waste, so you go fix that. And then you start to get into the last point, that executive sponsorship of things like the hackathons. But again, that's really more of a Band-Aid approach. Where the real change starts to happen with the run stage folks is changing the organizational and team structures and getting executive support at the highest levels to make this a priority across the board. So early things people were starting to do were, have these conversations about cost trade-offs in the architectural reviews. Critically, and I think this is one of the, maybe not easiest, but it's kind of one of the most obvious, I think, is getting these things into like weekly backlogs, into your Scrum reviews, so it's not a Band-Aid approach. Backlogging these things, but ultimately getting to the last few, which is how do we start to get the CTO, the CIO to say to the engineering operations teams, this is a priority. No, it needs to not come in front of features and velocity, but in the areas where we can, it's part of your job to look at cost. And let's figure out where we can prioritize, maybe in dev and test, to cut more costs, understanding we want to spend more in other areas like production and whatnot. Some of the best ones I saw, I think, from the cloud natives who have a little more flexibility in budgeting than enterprises was they were letting teams re-spend the money they saved, so reinvest it in additional headcount. Spotify did a great talk with us last year where they were literally showing teams the cost of their waste in terms of engineering heads and said, yeah, if you take this action, we can hire 7 more engineers over the course of a year. And it's that type of really incentivizing to speak to the engineers what they need. They need help, they need additional hands, they need areas that you can start to move the needle. One of the biggest challenges though, and I think the theme I saw through all this was sort of trust like in the data, trust in the partners, and really starting to get like governance and policies in place. Very few had these things set up. A lot of this stuff was around, as I said at the bottom, awareness, cultural shifts, collaboration. So we also asked, as part of this, what are you automating? How much are you automating? And by the way, I think I have it at the end, but if you go to data.finops.org, we'll show it at the end, you can see all the report data, diving into more detail and doing a high level overview here. But not surprisingly, about half, it was just under, I think 48%, are automating nothing or next to nothing. For those walk stage people, that went up to 70% not doing automation, all human work. When we dug into what they were actually doing in automation, it was only about 18% who were doing automation that was affecting the infrastructure, right sizing, resizing, turning things off, those types of things. Most of the automation that was being done, which I think speaks to that issue we have earlier about getting engineers to take action, was literally just automating alerting to the teams, right? Or automating, letting people know when their tagging hygiene was bad. These are critical things, but ultimately aren't very scalable in the process. So we also asked people, what is preventing you from automating? And this is a word cloud from some of the words that popped up here I thought was interesting. It tended to be skills, lack of people, lack of time, lack of resources. It wasn't as much, there was some about tooling, there was some about technology, but people were just unable to get there, either because they didn't have enough central automation, expertise, or because the central team was pushing automation, but the actual, product teams at the end own their own infrastructure and weren't making it a priority for it. So we also asked, what are the blockers, right? And unpack this a bit. And here we go. I mean, it's knowledge and manpower. We don't know how to do it. It's, we're trying to use modern application development and we've got resource constraints. I love this one, which was the third from the bottom. First we needed acceptance from business unit leaders, which we struggled with. Then we didn't have enough cloud engineers. And then ultimately we didn't have a strong policy in place to do this. So I think this really highlights, and as years of looking in this space, everyone aspires to get here, but it's so hard to do. So, that's very much conversation that we're looking at with our run stage folks is how do we help you get to these areas? So as I mentioned, the data is available at data.finops.org, but I'll pass back to Chuck to kind of dig into his take on this stuff and we can circle back at the end for more questions.
JR, while we switch over here, maybe I'll just ask a question for you from the webinar. One of the participants said, it's often said that most companies take the savings identified by FinOps and then roll them over to basically self-fund new cloud projects. In essence, the argument that's FinOps savings beget more cloud spend, not less. But just wondering if that belief is actually true. Is that what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I love the phrase, the dirty little secret of cloud spend is that it never goes down, it always goes up, right? Particularly in the enterprise. I think that's accurate, and that speaks to really what I think the best description of FinOps should be, which is maximizing the value you receive from cloud spend. The biggest issue I've seen with unoptimized cloud spend in the enterprise who are trying to migrate is a CFO, a CIO who's more comfortable with data center will come in and say, this stuff is out of control, we got to slow it down, we got to stop it, right? So even if the money isn't being reinvested, there needs to be a strong, not just sense, but data showing that it is valuable and effective and efficient so that they're comfortable moving more quickly. But yeah, we don't, in reality, we don't see a lot of companies, doing massive bill cuts, or they do those temporarily, but then they come back and they invest in, better data, better services, more engineers, et cetera, which I think is the right idea. Cloud is not about cost savings, it's about innovation, agility, and moving more quickly.
It's so interesting to see the diversity of ideas that have been generated over the recent time and shared with you guys. I like to think of it as a supply chain, an expensive supply chain like any other. And if it's sort of a sidebar interest, then that's one thing. But when it's core to your business, whether you're a manufacturer with raw material in a supply chain, I mean, the notion of leaving $24 million savings on the floor just because it's so small, at some point in every supply chain, people start to turn the screws and start to drive efficiency. And it's just
there's two things with that not come up. There's also the question of like, when do we do this? And it's like, well, if you're smart, you start doing it early if it's a long process, but invariably it is when it becomes material, right? Either to the IT spend or to the CFO, and it becomes more material with the switch to OpEx because it can have a bigger impact on margins. So, we're working actually on some content as well of like, what are the things you should consider about when to start? But it really is dependent on company. And there's typically a spend panic moment, right? That has to happen first.
So let's talk about optimizing that supply chain and the notion of the cost challenge. And we like to think of it as kind of this triangular pyramid that in optimizing cloud expenditure, cloud infrastructure expenditure, you have both the ability to buy and get maximal discounts, make commitments, those sorts of things. You talked a bit about that, JR. But the bottom part of this is the act of actually correcting your consumption. So yes, you should get the best discounts, but to a certain extent, it's a bit of a band-aid on efficient usage. Again, back to the manufacturing notion, if you were leaving half your raw materials or a quarter or 40%, 25% to waste, at some point, someone would say, we got to do something with that. The problem in cloud and IT infrastructure is that there are a lot of inhibitors that get in the way of actually being able to get at this. And it's what leaves finance to try to deal with just getting the right discounts, because it's so hard to do the bottom part historically. It's decentralized. We talked about that. There's a perception of risk. Do you really want to change that? It's running well. There's so many of them. How would we ever tackle it? And to your point, what's the motivation? And what we've found in our customers, if we look at where they are in the journey, the crawl, walk, run, or just how effective they are, the best in class from an efficiency perspective, in our experience, share a number of attributes. And I've listed them down the left. Everything from, is it an organizational priority? Are there incentives to act? You covered that. Is there a standardized criteria by which you measure whether something is efficient or cost effective? Trust is a big one. We'll talk about that. Is there an understood and repeatable process so that it's just part of the cycle? And can we drive automation so that we can do it at scale? When we look at the organizations that do well and not so well, some distinct patterns certainly emerge. The notion that senior levels set the tone and the importance, and that they have a mechanism, whether it's gamified or whether it's just part of the compensation programs for leaders to drive efficiency. Those two really set the tone for really everything. When you get down into the act of figuring it out and doing it, the next thing is critical that there be a central policy that defines the criteria for whether something is good or bad, or efficient or inefficient, versus leaving it to just individual judgment and interpretation. Trust is absolutely critical, because if the people that hold the keys to allow change or own the applications or own the infrastructure don't trust, they won't allow change, and optimization won't happen. The repeatable process, the ability to do it every day versus it be ad hoc or best efforts projects, and then automation, reducing manual effort to its absolute minimum so that you can spend time doing the things that are more important to the business. So that, in our experience, are the things that set apart great from less so. If we assume that the critical and organizational elements of setting direction are in place, because that has to be there. There has to be the view that it's important to the organization to look at this expensive supply chain and deal with it. Let's assume that that's in place. How do you deal with the systems, process, and culture, which is where a lot of the challenge lives? It's why a lot of those really creative mechanisms that JR mentioned exist. Everything from reducing bonuses, or playful nudging I saw on the list, which was an interesting one. This is where the challenges lie. So how do you go after this? And what do the most effective organizations do? So let's zero in on this and look at these in a little more detail. If you set a standardized central policy, there are no excuses or surprises. If an answer is driven to say something should change, and everyone understands the yardstick by which it was measured or interpreted, there should be no resistance. It's easy to say, but people should understand. If there is trust and transparency, optimizations are allowed to happen. If there's a repeatable process, it's change managed and controlled and part of the regular daily management of that infrastructure. And if there's automation, it can be done at scale. Large enterprises can do this every day in a manageable way. So these are the reasons for these four elements. Let's look at them in a little more detail. JR, did you want to add anything at all to that? Or
I was kind of curious. I was going to ask you on your last slide, when you talk about resource efficiency, what do you measure that by? What's the underlying formula for that?
Resource efficiency would be a measure of what is determined empirically that entity needs versus what it's actually being fed.
Okay.
So it's not well, it's a great segue actually, because we like to refer to objectifying infrastructure. That policy, the measure of whether something's getting what it truly needs or not, if you can have central agreement on that and have a central way of deciding, it is the basis by which you can then drive trustable recommendations automatically. So, and we'll come back to that, the way an engine can do that, but it's the ability to say, this is empirically what something needs, this is empirically how it's behaving based on what it has today, and we recommend a change. Now, a lot of organizations deal with this subjectively, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I need a large because this app is important. The team just knows what the app needs. Don't bug us, we know what it needs, we built it. It's stable, so leave it alone. It gets busy at the end of the quarter. Leadership said, don't touch our stuff. Finance says the utilization on that thing is low according to their view. My scale group needs to be able to get really big because we need elastic capacity. Oftentimes what people believe when you empirically analyze, they're absolutely sometimes wrong. And so when we talk about objective measures and policy, there are things that look like this. Upsize something if its sustained and peak utilization are not being met by a current instance over a certain amount of time. Downsize something if sustained and peak utilization IOPS over a business cycle, certain business cycle can be met by a smaller instance. Change a family to meet app requirements and optimal cost and technical checks if technical checks are met, and an effort rating, which you can calculate, is low or medium. Set a scale group maximum based on machine learned peak of business cycle and node type. Silence anything that says it should change if it's going to negatively impact, a financial commitment or something we've done on the finance side. None of these things can be done, in an island. So these are more objective measures, and it's not hard to see that an objective measure, its potential is to pump it into something that's going to assess in an automated fashion. If you combine that with a deep understanding of workload patterns and historical behaviors over time, you inject infrastructure attributes, the cost, the technical, the billing data, perhaps any tagging that might imply other criteria that you want to be able to decision on, that it's possible to empirically, to scientifically derive, in line with the policy, the recommendations that could be applied back to an infrastructure safely to optimize for all of these constraints. And that's really sort of the promised land, is to get it out of the subjective, get it away from people making best guesses or educated guesses, and turn it into a scientific thing based on an organizational agreement of how these decisions are going to be driven in the form of policy. We see lots of times sort of siloed decision making. So maybe we'll look at instance optimization, maybe we'll look at scaling, and maybe we'll look at the purchase optimization. But you really can't deal with these individually. I can go off and make all sorts of instance level decisions that would put me offside, let's say, on a financial decision. I could make scaling changes without real understanding of instances inside that. That could be a problem. So solving for the union of this of these constraints is really important. Now, it's also been our experience that if you only equip an organization with the ability to run around and talk about cost, you won't drive trust. This same empirical analysis should be able to tell you whether something is risky or not performing as well. We often have customers say, you showed us an instance type, a family of instance that we didn't even know existed. It actually costs a little bit more, but our stuff is a much better match from a personality perspective. That goes a long way toward getting the hearts and minds of engineers and driving that trust. If I tell you first and foremost that you should upsize, modernize, or change family, regardless of cost, so that things run well, when I come around to tell you that there's actually a change that would save money, you're more likely to be trusting in that answer. Of course, that cascades into scaling, and at some point, of course, the financial side of it. But it's this balanced approach that an empirical take on optimization should be able to drive. I'll just pause there, JR. I don't know if you've got anything to inject.
Well, one of the things that you brought up earlier that I really loved was the idea of not just metrics, but thresholds. And Mike Fuller Atlassian, who's kind of started this whole FinOps thing with us, has this whole thing called metrics-driven cost optimization, where he says, like, metrics are fine and KPIs are fine, but unless you have agreed targets and that when I hit this thing, I'm going to do this thing, you either end up in this world where you're spending a lot of cycles watching, checking, working on it, or you get into cadence space where, oops, we get busy, we don't get to it, right? So I think that's really critical, is agreeing across all the groups, when we see this X happen, we are going to do Y, right, to get out of that subjective. Because a lot of the subjective, I find all those examples you have kind of ultimately come out to somebody in the engineering team saying, if I do this, I'm afraid I'm going to get paged in the middle of the night, right? It's going to go down, right? So how do we get out of that emotional conversation, which I think is spot on?
Well, if you as an organization decide that, let's say, your crown jewel is your market-facing application, banking, retail, what have you. If the organization decides you're going to run, a significant excess of available capacity, and everyone understands, and you embed it in the policy, then no one should be nagging you to make an optimization change because you haven't tripped the threshold that everyone agreed on, right? Mm-hmm. So part of codifying is to say, we're going to set, a policy that means we're going to run it tight or we're going to run it slack, and there should be, again, no surprises, right?
I think that comes to intentional decision making about it. Higher spend isn't necessarily bad spend if it's expected spend that has impact on customer experience or revenue.
Exactly, and it's why you can't just run around with, let's say, bill analysis, potentially trying to interpret something that was maybe made at a very technical level down in an architecture somewhere that could be reflected in policy. So. Now, containers are going to add significant further complexity to this. They need love too. The constructs are all the same. Don't burden people with trying to figure it out or guess at things. Use science to figure it out. And the same balance of upsizing, downsizing, requesting or reserving the right amount of capacity, those sorts of things. This game is going to get more complex as we go to containers. Now, the other thing that we've learned is that communicating with app owners is absolutely critical, because they may have been involved in the policy that the analytics used to show them what their stuff looks like, let's say over the last business cycle in its busiest day, what it projected would look like if the policy decision was allowed to be applied, hasn't been applied, but if it were to be allowed to be applied, and then what the increase in cost or reduction in cost is, but to seek their approval as a reasonable human, with this being half the cost, would you please approve this? You remember the policy we all agreed upon. You see the before and after. You see we're still leaving you white space. Your thing is going to operate just fine. We've used the yardstick that everyone agreed to. Would you please approve it? This app owner report is extremely important in getting the approval to be able to apply it back to the infrastructure. So this communication as part of the process is key. When you have the policy, you have the transparency, the communication, you have an engine that can take in all the terms in the equation, you're better able to run toward this, what we've called here the virtuous cycle, that says, we're giving you policy compliant optimization actions with a lot of rigor and all the terms in the equation. We're giving you the transparency and the evidence and the ability to trust, the opportunity to trust, the opportunity to approve and say, I approved an upside last month because they came to me with something that said my stuff would run better if I made this change. Now they're telling me there's an opportunity to improve efficiency. I'm going to approve that. The changes get executed, the quantities are appropriate, and purchases can be optimized on top of that appropriate quantity. This is sort of the desired cycle that codifying and then applying it back into the infrastructure can enable. We would also say that policy, precision, and that trust are really the foundation for automation. We hear very regularly organizations that say, for a couple of years, we've had hundreds of recommendations for optimization changes, but we don't trust them. By taking this approach, the ability to then drive automation and continuous optimization with a proper change control process is available. Now, these are just example components in an ecosystem or a stack. I don't take them too literally, but our most advanced customers that are using things like Terraform or CloudFormation to control infrastructure, they're able to constantly inject into the process the required or the optimal resources that can be change controlled and applied back to the infrastructure. Winding down to a great example, Autodesk, a customer of ours, a very significant AWS cloud infrastructure. Densify is operating as a central policy and analytics engine, as well as the ability to communicate it to the business. They're efficiently communicating with hundreds of app owners in the ways that I've just sort of articulated through the notion of that app owner report. Very quick ROI. But what I love about this story is that it is a fantastic example of the entire business aligning around a definition of what good looks like for them, how they want to run infrastructure. And the story I love is one that Mike Lee tells in a video that's up on our website about how their subjective or their team understanding of what they saw in their applications and behaviors and what they believed was optimal from a cost and performance perspective was completely different than what an empirical analysis derived, and allowed them to make the change, lower the cost, and maintain performance, or actually improve the performance of that application, and meet the needs of the business, but also meet the needs of the finance organization that has been able to transition from, and I'm putting words, my own words, but nagging the organization and constantly trying to retroactively deal with cost, to really just be one of receiving the benefit over time of it happening as part of the management of the infrastructure, and having the trust of the app owner as part of that process. And I invite you to watch that video. It's up on our homepage, and it's quite interesting. You hear from each of the perspectives of these individuals in their roles. And with that, I'd like to sort of circle back and summarize and sort of ask, how did we do against what we discussed today? I like to say you're kind of on your own here, because at a senior level and leadership level, someone has to realize that this needs to be taken in a programmatic way in an organization, and it's not just sort of a sidebar that we'll fix later. That's something that has to be dealt with, sort of fundamentally. But if we drive down into the tricky part here, I think we showed that by centralizing policy and codifying, you really set the basis for precision and a scientific approach to determining what should be done, and that approach should be balanced, should maybe find cost, but also risk reduction or performance improvement. And that balanced approach engenders trust. And trust gets rid of the fear of making change. A repeatable process that says you will be consulted, you will be given transparency as to why we've made this recommendation, or why the analytics have made the recommendation, allows people to understand that it's just part of the process, and that they're a critical part of the process, and can help further it. And then, the last mile is about taking manual effort out of this process and driving greater degrees of automation. I think we've shown how this approach can, demystify this notion of, and not pin it on engineers, because it's not just about engineers. It's about them being a critical part of it, but it's really an organizational challenge that has to be addressed. Did you have any further thoughts on that, Jared, as I go to?
Your standardized criteria row got me thinking about this similar challenge, I think, that happens in tagging. We often hear, which is like, well, I know we should tag, but where do we start? Like, what are the things we should tag, and how should we figure out our tagging policy? So I was curious to ask you, Chuck, like, how do you typically counsel people about where they should start with defining their first policies? Because you've got to get agreement, you've got to focus on the right things. Like, what's the 101 on central policy definition?
Yeah, it tends to be, actually, it's a good segue, not to turn it into a commercial for trial, but it actually is called out here as a key part of the very early engagement with us. So we're a SaaS delivered technology, so trials are a pretty low barrier to do. They set up quickly, they're non-agent driven, very non-intrusive. But the very first thing that happens when we ingest data is our POC staff will engage with the stakeholders and begin the initial look at those policies. So we come out of the box with a very flexible policy engine that is already pre-configured with some industry best practices as we would see them. And they tend to be very conservative and help key stakeholders understand if the historical behavior of those assets are this, and this conservative policy is applied, the conservative yardstick for what efficient looks like, and the state of the infrastructure is played back from a potential of optimization. That's really sort of ground zero as to what a base policy set would surface. As organizations get more comfortable and start actioning and trust builds, you're in a position to go back and look at, okay, we've set very conservative policies, let's say for utilization levels, the scoring mechanisms that we use to judge whether something is well utilized or not. Let's tick it up a level, an increment. Let's change the policy to tighten it a bit, and we move on from there. And what we find is that different business units, different classes of infrastructure, different geographies might have different ideas about how they want to run, and that can be reflected in that policy right down to the individual workload level. So it's generally a process of incrementally exploring how you want to run. And then at some point, as that trust builds, you move toward integrating to other processes and tools. You may be connected to your change management, your ticketing, and you drive toward this more continuous cost optimization. The whole point is to go from more manual, retroactive approaches toward continuous cost optimization and management. So that's the way our trial process works, and how we explore policy and the impact of policy on what you should be doing in the infrastructure. So let's move to Q&A. Andy, if you can let us know whether we've got any questions.
I've got a few actually here, Chuck. I've got 3 probably, and I think that's going to fit in about right with the rest of the time we have. So one for JR. So JR, what sort of FinOps challenges can our organization expect as we transition over to containers? I know that's not the #1 problem right now, but it's building. Any recommendations or counsel for that person?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I remember when we were doing the containers book or containers chapter in the FinOps book, we didn't really know where to put it, because you basically had all the challenges that you had with infrastructure all rolled up into containers, right? You have a new allocation challenge with labels and namespaces wherever it's sitting. You've got a new optimization challenge to optimize within the clusters, within the containers, and then to optimize the underlying infrastructure. And you've got a whole new set of automation challenges with different toolings to deal with all this. So I think it's all the same. It's as Chuck was alluding to, it's like, it's virtualization on top of virtualization. And it's another set of muscles. I love, Chuck, you had the circular FinOps virtuous cycle. We have our FinOps life cycle. The idea is, you want to be moving through all those phases very quickly, because when you figure out your allocation strategy, containers pop in and it changes it, right? You start to figure out optimization, et cetera. So unfortunately, yeah, it's sort of all the same bits, but the principle of making sure the teams are able to iterate quickly, get that trust, get the visibility, so they can ultimately start to optimize is the same there.
Okay, Chuck, I've got one for you here, and it's more around the right sizing of the instance. So you had an ecosystem diagram. The question's around the automation. It's like, I don't understand how you can right size my instance. Won't it go back to the original size when I redeploy my Terraform template? And what about like a brand new workload?
So one of the things that we noted earlier in our product lifecycle with public cloud was that the technologies like Terraform and CloudFormation, as they're used to control infrastructure, they almost negate the ability to do what people were comfortable doing over time, is go up to an admin console and maybe change something from a large to a medium, because the next time that thing is instantiated, it just goes back to what was in the code. So the approach that we've taken is to establish a central repository, a parameter repository, that becomes the single point of truth for the specified optimal resource. And other systems like a Terraform or a DevOps toolchain can refer to that repository, again, going through a change management process that says, hey, the analytics say this should look more like this. And if you approve it, it gets at the next deploy. If it's immutable infrastructure, maybe every day it's being stamped out fresh. Those resource specifications can be applied. Now, if it's determined, and I see another question related to effort scoring, we can calculate actually whether something's easy or moderate or harder to do, depending on the technical side of it. It might include a human having to do something and even change code or what have you, but that can go through a change management process as well. As far as deploying some, actually, Andy, you're probably a better person to answer. What about things that didn't exist before and you couldn't watch them prior?
Right.
How we deal with that?
Yeah, since we come up with the answers based on history. So the interesting thing is that this concept of a fallback workload type, which they're going to define anyhow in a template that says, hey, I want it to be this, or I want all my web servers or app servers to be that. So that can be used as part of that, the parameter store or that central repository saying something happens and I have to go back, or the default is make it this. So that's essentially the answer. And the other interesting part of it is, as that workload changes over time, that parameter can still be referenced. So if all of a sudden I downsized it this month, but 3 months from now it got really busy for some reason, the lack of that hard coding will make that flexible, and it will always be the correct size. And that's probably a topic for another webinar, and we don't want to get too deep here. I'm going to have probably JR wrap up on one question is, and the interesting question, is it not taking recommendations? Is it still a valid excuse? Chuck had a long list of excuses there that people say, hey, size like this for a reason, or it's an old app, don't touch it. Do you think it's still a valid excuse in some cases or in all cases?
To just not do it?
Yeah, just not do it. Knowing that there's a FinOps practice now, I think it's kind of a loaded question.
I think this all comes back to organizational priority, right? And making sure it's aligned with what the FinOps optimization team is trying to do with that individual product's priorities, right? And sometimes it is okay to do that because it is going to slow things down. But getting those conversations going, getting alignment around what's important, and I think one of the things we talk about a lot is building the business case for it that says, okay, here's what it would take to do it, level of effort, here's what the savings would be. And it's okay if you decide not to do it, but you should document the reason why and be able to report on what you haven't done. And over time, see who is saying no a lot and who is saying yes more often.
Well, thanks, JR, for spending the time with us and sharing that really interesting data. Hopefully people took some pointers from this and some ideas. Of course, either pop over to the FinOps Foundation and register and become part of that community. I've personally sat in on a number of those discussions, and they're very interesting, very practical. And JR does a great job of keeping the vendors out of the picture too much. So it truly is a sort of birds of a feather approach without pesky vendors in there trying to sell stuff.
No pitching, Chuck, no pitching.
Yeah. So
thanks for having me.
Check that out. The ebook referenced covers a lot of the topics that we discussed today, and invite you to download that as well. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, thanks.